The champagne flute slipped from my trembling fingers, crystal shattering against the marble floor of Riverside Gardens Estate as 300 wedding guests turned to stare. Rachel Davis stood triumphantly at the microphone, her voice carrying across the stunned silence like a blade through silk. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced with practiced cruelty, "I think you all deserve to know exactly who Katie Sullivan really is before my brother Alex makes the biggest mistake of his life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." My heart hammered against my ribs as she held up what appeared to be official-looking documents, her perfectly manicured fingers gripping them like weapons. The fairy lights strung above the reception tent suddenly felt blinding, each bulb exposing me under their harsh glow. Alex, my fiancé of 2 years, stood frozen beside his groomsmen, his face pale as morning frost. The woman I had trusted as a sister, who had helped me choose this very dress, was about to destroy everything I had built. The morning had started like a dream. Sunlight streamed through the bridal suite windows at the historic Riverside Gardens Estate, casting golden patterns across my wedding dress hanging pristinely on its satin hanger. Portland's autumn air carried the scent of roses from the gardens below, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. I was Katie Sullivan, a 29-year-old elementary school teacher from a small farming town in eastern Oregon, about to marry Alex Bennett, the successful architect who had swept me off my feet 3 years ago at a coffee shop downtown. Alex came from money, old Portland money that traced back to timber barons and shipping magnates. His family owned Bennett and Associates Architecture, a firm that had designed half the city's most prestigious buildings. I knew I didn't fit their world of country clubs and charity galas, but Alex had assured me repeatedly that none of that mattered. His love was enough, he said. His family would come to adore me just as he did. Rachel Davis, Alex's older sister and business partner, had seemed to embrace me from the beginning. She had insisted on planning our engagement party, helped me select my wedding dress, and even offered to coordinate the entire ceremony. Her enthusiasm felt genuine, her smiles warm, and I found myself grateful to have gained not just a husband but a sister. She understood the family dynamics, she explained, and wanted to make sure I felt welcomed into their circle. The Bennett family estate sprawled across 15 acres of pristine Oregon countryside, with manicured gardens that had been featured in architectural magazines. Their wealth wasn't flashy but rather the quiet, understated kind that spoke of generations of careful investment and social positioning. Alex's parents, Robert and Patricia Bennett, maintained a polite but distant relationship with me. They never openly disapproved, but I sensed their reservation in the careful way they chose their words, the slight pause before they included me in family conversation. During our engagement, I had thrown myself into fitting into their world. I took etiquette classes, studied wine appreciation, and learned about art and classical music. Alex seemed amused by my efforts, often telling me I was perfect just as I was, but I wanted to prove myself worthy of their son. I volunteered at their preferred charities, attended their social functions, and gradually felt like I was earning their acceptance. The wedding planning had been Rachel's domain. She insisted on handling every detail, from the florist to the catering to the guest list. When I offered to contribute or make suggestions, she would smile sweetly and remind me that she knew all the best vendors, understood the family's expectations, and wanted this day to be absolutely perfect for Alex and me. Her generosity seemed boundless, and I felt lucky to have such a devoted sister-in-law to be. Mark Thompson, Alex's best friend since college and business associate, had always been cordial but distant. He worked closely with both Alex and Rachel at the firm, and I sometimes caught him watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. When I mentioned it to Alex, he laughed it off, saying Mark was just protective of his friends and needed time to warm up to new people. Linda Hayes, Alex's aunt and the family matriarch, commanded respect at every gathering. She had never married, dedicating her life to preserving the family's social standing and business interests. Her approval seemed crucial to everyone in the Bennett circle, and while she had never been unkind to me, I sensed I was still being evaluated, weighed against some invisible standard I didn't fully understand. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of dress fittings, venue selections, and menu tastings. Rachel had insisted on the most expensive options for everything, assuring me that the family wanted to spare no expense for Alex's wedding. When I expressed concern about the costs, She waved away my worries, explaining that this wedding would reflect on the entire Bennett family name and needed to be flawless. As I sat in the bridal suite that morning, surrounded by bouquets of white roses and peonies, my childhood friends from back home finished the last touches on my makeup. Jenny Martinez, my college roommate, had driven up from California to be my maid of honor. She had been the one constant voice of reason throughout the wedding planning, occasionally expressing concern about how much control I had surrendered to Rachel. "You look absolutely radiant," Jenny said, adjusting my veil one final time. "Alex is going to lose his mind when he sees you walking down that aisle." The other bridesmaids, a mix of my teaching colleagues and Alex's female cousins, bustled around the suite, taking photos and sipping mimosa. The atmosphere was festive, filled with laughter and excitement, but I noticed how Alex's family members seemed to cluster together, speaking in hushed tones that stopped whenever I approached. My own family had arrived the night before for the rehearsal dinner. My parents, simple, hard-working people who had sacrificed to put me through college, seemed overwhelmed by the grandeur of the Bennett estate. They were staying at a modest hotel downtown, insisting they didn't want to impose, despite Rachel's offer to accommodate them at the family property. My younger brother Danny, fresh out of the Marines and still adjusting to civilian life, had seemed uncomfortable in his rented tuxedo during the rehearsal. The ceremony itself was scheduled for 4 o'clock, allowing for golden hour photography in the estate's garden. 300 guests were expected, representing Portland's social and business elite, alongside my modest circle of family and friends. The guest list had grown far beyond what Alex and I had originally planned, with Rachel explaining that certain people simply had to be invited for business and social reasons. As the morning progressed, I felt a growing sense of anticipation mixed with nervous energy. This was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, the culmination of a love story that had transformed me from a small-town teacher into the wife of one of Portland's most eligible bachelors. Yet something felt slightly off, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what was causing my unease. Rachel appeared in the bridal suite around noon, looking impeccable in her navy blue maid of honor dress. Her smile was radiant as she surveyed the scene, complimenting the flowers, the lighting, and how beautiful everyone looked. She had insisted on giving a speech during the reception, explaining that as Alex's sister, she had special insights into our love story that the guests would appreciate hearing. "Katie, darling," she said, approaching me with a small wrapped box, "I have something special for you." Something that belonged to Alex's grandmother. Inside was a delicate pearl bracelet, vintage and obviously valuable. "She would have wanted you to wear this today," Rachel continued, fastening it around my wrist. "You're officially part of the family now." The gesture moved me deeply, and I hugged her with genuine emotion. Despite my occasional doubts about fitting into the Bennett world, moments like these convinced me that I was truly welcomed and loved. Rachel's eyes seemed to glisten with tears as she held me, whispering that today would be unforgettable for everyone involved. The ceremony proceeded flawlessly. Alex looked devastatingly handsome in his custom tuxedo as I walked down the petal-strewn aisle on my father's arm. The setting was breathtaking, with the estate's gardens providing a perfect backdrop of autumn colors. Our vows were heartfelt and personal, drawing tears from many guests and affirming my belief that we were meant to be together. After the ceremony, cocktail hour unfolded on the estate's terrace overlooking the valley. Guests mingled with drinks while photographers captured candid moments and formal portraits. The atmosphere was elegant and festive, exactly what Rachel had promised. I felt like a princess in my flowing dress, accepting congratulations and well wishes from people I barely knew but who seemed genuinely happy for Alex and me. As the sun began to set, guests were directed to the reception tent, a magnificent structure that had been transformed into something from a fairy tale. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, while thousands of white flowers created an enchanted garden atmosphere. The head table overlooked the dance floor, with Alex and me positioned at the center, surrounded by our wedding party. Dinner was served flawlessly, course after course of gourmet cuisine paired with expensive wine. The Bennett family spared no expense, and I found myself overwhelmed by their generosity. Toasts began after the main course, with Alex's father offering warm words about welcoming me into their family, followed by my father's emotional speech about his little girl finding happiness. It was then that Rachel stood up, approaching the microphone with that confident smile I had come to know so well. The crowd settled into expectant silence, anticipating the sister's traditional toast to the happy couple. But something in her demeanor had shifted, a hardness entering her eyes that made my stomach clench with sudden anxiety. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the sophisticated sound system. Before we celebrate this union, I believe there are some things you all should know about the woman my brother has chosen to marry. The words hit me like ice water, each syllable precisely enunciated and loaded with meaning. Around me, the festive atmosphere began to shift, guests leaning forward with curiosity that was quickly turning into something dark. Alex rose halfway from his chair, his face showing confusion and growing alarm. "Rachel, what are you doing?" he called out, but she held up a hand to silence him. "Alex, darling, I know this is difficult, but the family has a responsibility to protect you," she continued, her voice now carrying a tone of false concern that sent chills down my spine. "We've discovered some very troubling information about Katie's background that changes everything." The tent fell silent except for the soft rustling of evening breeze through the canvas. 300 pairs of eyes focused on me as Rachel reached into her purse and withdrew what appeared to be official document. My mouth went dry as I realized that whatever was coming next had been carefully planned and orchestrated. "You see," Rachel continued, her voice now carrying across the stunned crowd, "while we were conducting routine background checks for the prenuptial agreement, we discovered that Katie hasn't been entirely honest about her past." She held up the papers, making sure everyone could see them.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"These documents show that our dear Katie has been married before, not just married, but divorced under very questionable circumstances." Gasps rippled through the crowd as I felt the blood drain from my face. The accusation was so unexpected, so completely false, that for a moment I couldn't even process what was happening. I had never been married before Alex. There were no questionable circumstances in my past. Yet Rachel continued with the confidence of someone presenting undeniable truth. "Furthermore," she went on, "the financial records show a pattern of targeting wealthy men, extracting money from them, and then disappearing when the relationships end." She gestured toward me with theatrical disappointment. "My brother, in his generous nature, has been completely deceived by someone who saw him as nothing more than a financial opportunity." The crowd's energy shifted palpably. Whispers began circulating as guests turned to look at me with expressions ranging from curiosity to disgust. Alex stood fully now, his face white with shock and confusion. "Rachel, stop this immediately," he demanded, but his voice lacked conviction, and I could see doubt creeping into his eyes. "I have witness statements," Rachel continued relentlessly, "from her previous victims, documenting her methods and the financial damage she's caused. I have copies of legal proceedings where she was required to return money obtained under false pretense." She paused dramatically, letting the implications sink in. "I have proof that everything she's told us about her background, her family, her career has been carefully constructed lies." My legs felt weak as I gripped the edge of the table. The fairy tale wedding had transformed into a nightmare, with every eye in the tent focused on me with growing suspicion. The expensive dress suddenly felt like a costume, the elegant setting like a stage where I was being publicly executed. Jenny, my maid of honor, stood up beside me, her face flushed with anger. "This is insane," she declared loudly. "I've known Katie since college. Everything you're saying is completely false." But Rachel was prepared for this too. "I'm afraid Miss Martinez has been deceived as well," she said with false sympathy. "Katie is very skilled at maintaining long-term deceptions. We have documentation showing that even her supposed teaching career is fabricated." The lies were so elaborate, so detailed, that I could see how they might sound convincing to people who didn't know me well. But the guests didn't know me well. Most were Alex's family and friends, business associates and social contacts who had accepted me only because I was attached to him. Now, faced with what appeared to be evidence of deception, their acceptance was crumbling in real time. Alex finally found his voice, though it shook with emotion. "Rachel, where did this information come from? Why didn't you tell me about this before today?" "We only received the final confirmation yesterday," she replied smoothly. "Mark and I have been investigating quietly for months, hoping we were wrong, praying that our concerns were unfounded, but the evidence is overwhelming." Mark Thompson stepped forward from the groomsmen's table, holding additional papers. "Alex, I'm sorry, but we couldn't let you go through with this without knowing the truth," he said, his voice heavy with manufactured regret. "These bank records show money transfers that correspond exactly with the timeline of her previous relationships." The systematic nature of their attack was becoming clear. This wasn't a spontaneous revelation but a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to destroy me publicly and complete. Every detail had been planned, every piece of supposed evidence prepared in advance. The timing, at the moment of our greatest happiness, and in front of our entire social circle, was calculated for maximum devastation. Linda Hayes, the family matriarch, stood slowly from her seat at the family table. Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "This is precisely why we maintain certain standards," she said, her gaze fixed on me with cold disapproval. We tried to give her the benefit of the doubt, but blood will tell. The phrase hit me like a physical blow. Blood will tell. The implication that my working-class background had somehow predetermined this moment of supposed revelation. That despite my efforts to prove myself worthy, I had always been destined to betray their trust. My parents sat at their assigned table, their faces showing confusion and hurt. My father started to rise, perhaps to defend me, but my mother placed a restraining hand on his arm. They were outnumbered and overwhelmed in this environment, unsure how to respond to accusations they didn't understand. The champagne flute slipped from my fingers then, the crystal shattering against the marble floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the sudden silence. All eyes turned to me, waiting for my response, my denial, my explanation. Rachel stood triumphantly at the microphone, having delivered her performance flawlessly. But as I stood there, surrounded by the wreckage of what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, something unexpected happened. Instead of the tears they were expecting, instead of the desperate denials they had scripted for this moment, I felt a strange calm settling over me. Because there was something Rachel didn't know, something none of them knew, and in that moment of supposed defeat, with 300 pairs of eyes watching my apparent humiliation, I realized that they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated exactly who Katie Sullivan really was. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity as I remained standing, surrounded by the debris of shattered crystal and shattered expectation. Rachel's satisfied smirk wavered slightly as she waited for me to crumble, to beg to provide the dramatic breakdown that would complete her carefully orchestrated performance. Instead, I reached down and picked up one of the larger pieces of the champagne flute, examining it thoughtfully in the light of the crystal chandeliers. "Fascinating," I said quietly, my voice carrying in the hushed tent. "You know, Rachel, I have to admire the thoroughness of your presentation." I set the glass shard on the table with deliberate care. The fake documents, the fabricated witness statements, the coordinated timing, it's almost artistic in its cruelty. Alex stepped toward me, his face a mixture of confusion and growing concern. "Katie, what are you talking about? Are you saying this isn't true?" I turned to face him fully, and for the first time since Rachel had begun her attack, I allowed myself a small smile. "Oh, Alex, sweet trusting Alex, none of this is true, and somewhere deep down, you know that. But more importantly, this entire charade tells us everything we need to know about your family's real feelings about our marriage." Rachel's confidence flickered, just for a moment. "You can deny it all you want, but the evidence speaks for itself," she said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier authority. "Evidence," I repeated, savoring the word. "Yes, let's talk about evidence." I walked slowly around the head table, my wedding dress trailing behind me like armor. "Tell me, Rachel, exactly when did you commission these fake documents? Was it before or after you convinced Alex to change his will last month?" The shift in the room's energy was immediate and palpable. Alex's head snapped toward his sister, his eyes widening with realization. "What is she talking about, Rachel? I don't know what she means." Rachel stammered, but her face had gone pale. "She's obviously desperate and making things up." I continued my slow circuit of the table, addressing the crowd as if I were giving a lecture to my elementary student. "You see, everyone, the interesting thing about false accusations is that they often reveal more about the accuser than the accused. Rachel has spent considerable time and money creating this elaborate fiction, which raises the question why." Mark Thompson stepped forward, his jaws set with determination. "Because we care about Alex and couldn't stand by while he was being manipulated." "Manipulated?" I mused, stopping directly in front of him. "That's an interesting choice of words, Mark, especially coming from someone who's been embezzling from Bennett and Associates for the past 18 months. The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. Mark's face went white, then red, then white again. "That's a lie," he sputtered, but his voice lacked conviction. I asked conversationally, "because I have documentation proving otherwise. Bank transfers, falsified receipts, offshore accounts. Would you like me to be more specific? Or shall we save that for the authorities?" Alex looked between Mark and me, his world clearly tilting on its axis. "Katie, how could you possibly know about any of this?" I turned back to my husband, my expression gentle but firm. "Because, darling, I've spent the last 6 months conducting my own investigation, You see, I may be a small-town teacher, but I'm not naive. When your family began treating me like a potential threat rather than a welcome addition, I decided to find out why. The crowd was riveted now, the earlier hostility replaced by fascination as they sensed the power dynamic shifting dramatically. Linda Hayes remained seated, but her knuckles were white as she gripped her wine glass. "What investigation?" Rachel demanded, though her voice had lost all its earlier venom. I reached into the hidden pocket of my wedding dress, a modification I had specifically requested from the seamstress. From it I withdrew a small digital recorder and placed it on the table. "The investigation that captured this conversation from 3 weeks ago." I pressed play, and Rachel's voice filled the tent, crystal clear through the sound system. "The little gold digger thinks she's so clever, but she has no idea what's coming. Once we destroy her reputation publicly, Alex will be so grateful that we saved him from embarrassment that he'll never question the business restructuring." The prenup was just the beginning. The gasp that went up from the crowd was audible, but I wasn't finished. Mark's voice came next. "And if she tries to fight back, we have enough fabricated evidence to bury her in legal proceedings for years. By the time it's all sorted out, we'll have moved all the assets offshore." Then Linda's voice, cold and calculating, "The girl never belonged in this family anyway. Working-class breeding always shows eventually. This way, Alex learns his lesson and we maintain control of the company." The silence that followed was deafening. Alex stood frozen, staring at his family members as if seeing them for the first time. The gathered guests shifted uncomfortably, many looking toward the exits as they realized they had witnessed something far more complex than a simple wedding day drama. Rachel lunged toward the recorder, but I calmly picked it up and held it out of reach. "There's more," I said pleasantly. "Hours more, actually. Detailed plans for how you intended to frame me. Discussions about which offshore accounts you'd use to hide Alex's inheritance, and some particularly interesting conversations about how you plan to have me committed to a psychiatric facility if I refuse to disappear quietly." "This is insane," Linda said, finally finding her voice. "Even if such recordings existed, they would be inadmissible in court. You can't record people without their consent." I tilted my head thoughtfully. "You know, you're absolutely right about Oregon's recording law, which is why I didn't record you in Oregon." I gestured toward the tent opening. "Would you like to meet the person who actually made these recordings?" On cue, a figure stepped into the tent from the gardens beyond. He was tall, distinguished, wearing a crisp military dress uniform, decorated with ribbons and medals. His presence commanded immediate attention, and several guests who recognized him stood straighter in their chairs. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, "I'd like you to meet Colonel James Rodriguez, United States Army Intelligence, recently returned from overseas deployment." I paused as the implication sank in. "Also known as my older brother." The effect was electric. My supposedly simple farming family background crumbled as the distinguished military officer approached the head table with measured steps. His uniform marked him as someone of significant rank and importance, not the kind of person associated with the rural poverty Rachel had implied. Alex stared at the man approaching us, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly. "Your brother? But I thought, your family. You said?" "I said we were from Eastern Oregon, and that my father worked the land," I replied calmly. "I never said we were poor farmers. The Rodriguez Ranch encompasses 12,000 acres and has been in our family for 4 generations. It's one of the largest cattle operations in the Pacific Northwest." Colonel Rodriguez reached the head table and, with military precision, took my hand and kissed it formally. The gesture was respectful, traditional, and unmistakably that of a brother honoring his sister. "Congratulations on your wedding, Katie," he said, his voice carrying easily through the tent. "Though I suspect the celebration might be somewhat different than originally planned." The crowd buzzed with whispers as they processed this revelation. The humble schoolteacher they had been prepared to dismiss as a gold digger was suddenly revealed as someone with connections to both military intelligence and significant agricultural wealth. Rachel found her voice first, though it shook with barely controlled panic. "This doesn't change anything. The documents we have were created by a private investigation firm that specializes in corporate espionage," Colonel Rodriguez interrupted smoothly. "The same firm that's currently under federal investigation for fabricating evidence in multiple cases." He reached into his jacket and withdrew an official-looking envelope. "This is a federal warrant for the arrest of everyone involved in the conspiracy to defraud Alex Bennett of his inheritance." The tent erupted in chaos. Several guests bolted for the exits, while others pressed forward to get a better view of the unfolding drama. Mark Thompson was already backing toward the rear of the tent, his face ashen with terror. "Wait," Alex said, his voice cutting through the noise. "I still don't understand. Katie, if your family has money, if your brother is, why did you let everyone think you were just a poor teacher?" I turned to face him fully, and for the first time that day, I allowed genuine emotion to enter my voice. Because I wanted to be loved for who I am, not what I wanted to know that you chose me. Katie the teacher, Katie the woman who reads bedtime stories to second graders and volunteers at animal shelters. I didn't want to wonder if you loved me, or my family's ranch. The irony wasn't lost on me. In trying to create a false narrative about my background, Rachel had inadvertently exposed the very thing I had been hiding, that I came from exactly the kind of established wealth and social standing that the Bennett family claimed to value. Colonel Rodriguez stepped forward again, his bearing commanding absolute attention. "The recordings my sister provided were made during a joint operation between Army Intelligence and the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division. It seems your family's business practices have attracted federal attention for some time now." Linda Hayes stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "This is preposterous. We're respected members of this community. Our family has been building Portland for generations. Your family has been laundering money and evading taxes for generations." Colonel Rodriguez corrected matter-of-factly. "The renovation projects you've been billing to the city have been systematically overcharged, with the excess funds flowing into offshore accounts. The charitable foundation you run has been used as a front for tax evasion. Should I continue?" The systematic destruction of the Bennett family's facade was almost too much to process. Each revelation struck like a hammer blow, dismantling not just their attack on me, but their entire carefully constructed public image. Alex sat down heavily in his chair, his head in his hands. "My God," he whispered, "how long have you known?" "I started suspecting something was wrong about 4 months into our engagement," I admitted. "The way Rachel insisted on handling everything, the way your parents kept their distance, the conversations that stopped when I entered room. It felt less like they were protecting you, and more like they were protecting themselves from me." I walked over to where Jenny stood with the other bridesmaids, all of whom were staring at me with mixtures of amazement and concern. "Jenny, would you please tell everyone what you do for a living?" My college roommate cleared her throat, still processing the evening's revelations. "I'm a forensic accountant with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit," she said slowly. "Katie asked me to help investigate some irregularities she'd noticed in Alex's family business." The crowd's murmur grew louder. The simple teacher's simple friend was another federal agent. The web of deception was proving to run in both directions. But with a crucial difference. Mine was designed to protect, theirs to destroy. Rachel's composure finally cracked completely. "You manipulative bitch," she snarled, abandoning all pretense of concern for her brother. "You planned this entire thing. You targeted our family deliberately." "Actually," I replied calmly, "I met Alex completely by chance at a coffee shop. Everything that happened between us was genuine. It wasn't until your family started treating me like a threat that I began to wonder what you had to hide." I walked back to the microphone, taking control of the narrative that had been so dramatically wrested from Rachel. "You see, everyone, the tragedy here isn't that I deceived Alex about my background. The tragedy is that his family was so determined to control him and his inheritance, that they were willing to destroy his happiness to maintain their criminal enterprise." The federal agents began moving through the crowd, their presence becoming more obvious as they positioned themselves near the family members they had come to arrest. The fairy tale wedding was transforming into something resembling a crime drama, with guests who had come for champagne and celebration now witnessing the systematic dismantling of one of Portland's most prominent families. Alex finally looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of love, confusion and betrayal. "Katie, I need to know, do you love me, really love me, or was this all part of some investigation?" The question cut to the heart of everything. Despite the chaos surrounding us, despite the federal agents and the criminal charges and the family betrayals, this was the only thing that truly mattered. I knelt beside his chair, taking his hands in mine, my wedding dress pooling around us like a symbol of the dreams we had shared. "Alex, I fell in love with the man who brought me coffee every morning for 3 weeks before he worked up the courage to ask for my number. I fell in love with the architect who donated his services to design a new playground for my school. I fell in love with the person who cried during romantic movies and who spent his weekends volunteering at the animal shelter with me." Tears ran down his face as he searched my eyes for truth. "But you investigated my family. You brought federal agents to our wedding. I brought protection to our wedding, I corrected gently. When I realized your family was planning to destroy me publicly and steal your inheritance, I had to make a choice. I could disappear quietly and let them succeed, or I could fight for us, for our future, for the truth. The tent had grown quiet again as everyone strained to hear our conversation. This wasn't just about crime and punishment anymore, it was about love and trust, and the complexity of protecting someone from their own family. Colonel Rodriguez approached us, his expression softening as he looked at his sister. Alex, I've been watching Katie fall in love with you for 2 years. Every phone call home, every visit, every conversation has been about you. She never wanted to involve federal law enforcement. She hoped until the very last moment that your family would accept her and that none of this would be necessary. Alex looked between us, processing the magnitude of what had unfolded. His family, the people he had trusted most in the world, had been willing to destroy an innocent woman to maintain their control over him. Meanwhile, the woman he loved had uncovered their crimes but had tried to protect him from the truth until they forced her hand. The arrests began in earnest then. Rachel was taken into custody first, her earlier confidence completely shattered as handcuffs clicked around her wrists. Mark Thompson had been apprehended trying to leave through the catering entry. Linda Hayes maintained her dignity even as federal agents read her rights, though her face showed the defeat of someone whose carefully constructed world had collapsed in a single evening. As the chaos swirled around us, Alex and I remained in our bubble of conversation, trying to navigate the wreckage of what was supposed to be our perfect day. What happens now? He asked quietly. I stood smoothing my dress, and looked around at the scene of destruction and revelation. Now we decide if our love is strong enough to survive the truth. All of it, yours and mine. The fairy lights still twinkled overhead. The flowers still perfumed the air, but everything had changed. In trying to destroy me, Rachel had inadvertently revealed that I was far from the helpless victim they had imagined. But more than that, she had forced a moment of truth that would define our marriage from its very first. Whether that marriage would survive the revelations of this evening remained to be seen. 3 months later, I sat in the sunroom of the ranch house where I had grown up, watching the autumn light paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and amber. The sprawling Rodriguez ranch stretched to the horizon, 13 generations of careful stewardship, evident in every well-maintained fence line and healthy pasture. This was the heritage I had hidden from Alex, the wealth and stability I had feared would complicate our love. The legal proceedings had been swift and decisive. Rachel, Mark and Linda were all facing federal charges for conspiracy, fraud, and money laundering. The Bennett and Associates architecture firm had been dissolved, its assets seized as evidence. The family's carefully constructed social standing had crumbled as quickly as their criminal enterprise. Alex had made his choice within days of the wedding disaster. He had liquidated what remained of his personal assets, donated the proceeds to charity, and driven to Eastern Oregon to find me. He had stood in this very sunroom and asked not for forgiveness, but for the chance to earn my trust again, to build something real together without the shadow of his family's crimes or expectations. We had married again 6 weeks later, a simple ceremony in the ranch's chapel with only immediate family present. Colonel Rodriguez had walked me down the aisle in his dress uniform, while Alex waited at the altar looking more relaxed and genuine than I had ever seen him. Jenny had served as my maid of honor again, joking that she hoped this wedding would involve less federal law enforcement. The second ceremony had been everything our first had not: intimate, honest and free from the weight of deception. We had exchanged vows we wrote ourselves, promising not just to love each other but to protect the truth between us, no matter how difficult it might be. Alex had surprised me by how quickly he adapted to ranch life. The man who had designed Portland's skyline found unexpected joy in mending fences and checking cattle. He had started offering his architectural services pro bono to rural communities, designing schools and community centers for towns that could never have afforded his previous rate. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. In trying to protect him from what they saw as a gold digger, his family had actually prevented him from discovering a life of genuine purpose and fulfillment. Their crimes had been about maintaining control, but their exposure had set him free in ways they could never have imagined. My teaching career had taken an unexpected turn as well. The publicity from the wedding incident had led to offers from several universities, and I now split my time between the ranch and Portland State University, where I had been offered a position developing programs for children from military families. Colonel Rodriguez's connections had opened doors I hadn't known existed. The legal aftermath continued to unfold. Rachel had attempted to negotiate a plea deal by providing evidence against other participants in the money laundering scheme, but the federal prosecutors had been unimpressed by her cooperation. She was facing a minimum of 15 years in federal prison. Mark Thompson had been sentenced to 12 years after pleading guilty to embezzlement and conspiracy. Linda Hayes, as the ringleader of the family's criminal enterprise, was looking at 25 years to life. The most satisfying development had been the recovery of funds that had been stolen from various charities and municipal projects over the years. Alex had worked closely with federal investigators to identify all the fraudulent transactions, even when it meant exposing financial improprieties he had unknowingly participated in. His cooperation had been crucial to the investigation's success. As I sat in the sunroom that afternoon, reviewing applications for the new scholarship fund Alex and I had established for children of military families, I reflected on how dramatically life had changed. The woman who had stood in that wedding tent 6 months ago, facing public humiliation and false accusations, felt like a different person entirely. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Katie, this is Jessica Chen, a reporter with Portland Month. I'm working on a story about the Bennett family fraud case. Would you be willing to comment on your experience?" I deleted the message without responding. The media attention had been intense for several weeks after the arrests, but I had declined all interview requests. The story wasn't about revenge or vindication. It was about truth and the courage to fight for it, when everything seemed lost. Alex appeared in the doorway of the sunroom, still wearing his work clothes from helping with the evening chore. His face showed the kind of contentment I had never seen during our Portland days, when he had been constantly stressed about meeting his family's expectations and managing business pressures he hadn't fully understood. "How was your day?" I asked, setting aside the scholarship application. "Productive," he said, settling into the chair beside mine. "I finished the preliminary designs for the new community center in Burn. The town council is excited about the possibilities." We sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over land that had been in my family for generations. This was the life I had been afraid to share with him, worried that knowledge of my background would change how he saw me. Instead, it had given us both a foundation for building something genuine and lasting. "Do you ever regret it?" Alex asked quietly. "The way everything happened, I mean. The public humiliation, the legal battles, all of it?" I considered the question carefully. The wedding day disaster had been traumatic. Certainly. The months of legal proceedings had been exhausting, but the alternative would have been a marriage built on deception and manipulation, with me forever wondering if I was truly loved or simply controlled. "No," I said finally. "I regret that your family felt the need to be so cruel, and I regret that you had to learn the truth about them in such a painful way. But I don't regret fighting for us, for our future, for the truth." He reached over and took my hand, the simple gold band we had chosen for our second wedding catching the last rays of sunlight. "I love you, Katie Rodriguez Bennett," he said, using the hyphenated name I had chosen to honor both our families. "All of you. The teacher, the ranch owner's daughter, the sister of a decorated Army officer, the woman brave enough to take on an entire criminal conspiracy to protect our marriage." I squeezed his hand, feeling the truth of his words settle into the quiet space between us. "I love you too, Alex." The architect, the would-be rancher, the man who chose love over family loyalty, the person brave enough to start over completely when everything he thought he knew turned out to be lies. As darkness settled over the ranch, we moved inside to begin preparing dinner. The kitchen was warm and welcoming, filled with the kind of simple domestic harmony that had been impossible to achieve under the weight of his family's expectations and crimes. We worked together easily, the comfortable rhythm of partners who had weathered the worst storm imaginable and emerged stronger. Later, as we sat down to eat, Alex raised his wine glass in a toast. "To truth," he said simply. "To courage," I responded, touching my glass to his. "To second chances, to love that survives everything." We drank, and in that moment, I knew that despite everything we had endured, despite the betrayals and revelations and legal battles, we had succeeded in building exactly what I had always hoped for: a marriage based on truth, trust, and the kind of love that could withstand any test. The story of how they tried to humiliate me at my wedding had become the story of how we discovered who we really were, both individually and together. Sometimes the worst betrayals lead to the best beginnings, and sometimes the courage to fight for truth leads to more happiness than we ever dared to imagine. Outside, the Oregon night was clear and star-filled, stretching endlessly over land that represented generations of honest work and genuine values. Inside, two people who had found each other against all odds sat planning a future built on the strongest possible foundation: the truth they had been brave enough to fight for, no matter the cost. The federal agents moved with practiced efficiency through the reception tent, their coordinated actions creating an atmosphere of controlled chaos. What had begun as an elegant wedding celebration had transformed into something resembling a crime scene, complete with evidence bags and official documentation. Colonel Rodriguez stood at my side, his military bearing providing a steady anchor amid the swirling confusion of arrests and accusations. Rachel's composure had completely shattered as the handcuffs clicked into place around her wrist. The woman who had orchestrated such an elaborate performance just minutes earlier now struggled against the federal agents, her carefully styled hair falling loose as she twisted to look back at Alex with desperate eyes. "This is insane," she kept repeating, her voice rising to a near shriek. "Alex, you can't let them do this to me. I'm your sister. I was protecting you." But Alex remained seated at the head table, staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else entirely. The systematic destruction of everything he thought he knew about his family had left him in a state of shocked paralysis. The brother who had always looked up to Rachel, who had trusted her business judgment implicitly, was watching her being led away in federal custody for crimes he was only beginning to understand. Agent Sarah Martinez, the lead federal investigator who had been coordinating with Colonel Rodriguez for months, approached our table with a briefcase full of documents. Her presence commanded immediate attention from the remaining wedding guests, many of whom were now frantically whispering among themselves and glancing toward the exits. "Mrs. Rodriguez Bennett," she said formally, "we'll need you and your husband to come with us for debriefing. There are still some aspects of this investigation that require your cooperation." The use of my hyphenated name sent another ripple through the crowd. Even in this moment of crisis, the revelation that I had chosen to honor both my family heritage and my marriage was significant. It spoke to an identity that transcended the simple categories Rachel had tried to force me into. Mark Thompson was being escorted past our table, his expensive tuxedo wrinkled and his face ashen with the reality of his situation. As he passed, he looked directly at Alex with something approaching regret. "I never meant for it to go this far," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the chaos. "It started small, just moving some money around during lean months. But then it grew, and Rachel said we needed to protect the family business." Alex finally looked up, his eyes meeting those of his former best friend with a mixture of betrayal and genuine sadness. "Protect it from what, Mark? From success? From happiness? From the truth?" The question hung in the air unanswered as Mark was led away, leaving behind 2 decades of friendship destroyed by greed and deception. The systematic nature of the betrayal was becoming clearer with each revelation. This hadn't been a momentary lapse in judgment, but a calculated campaign that had been building for months, if not years. Linda Hayes maintained her dignity even in custody, her back straight and her expression composed despite the federal agents flanking her. As the family matriarch, she had clearly been the architect of much of the criminal enterprise, using her social connections and business acumen to create elaborate schemes for hiding assets and evading tax. Her arrest sent visible shockwaves through the remaining guests, many of whom were prominent Portland business leaders who had considered her a pillar of the community. "The irony," Colonel Rodriguez murmured to me as we watched the proceedings, "is that they could have simply accepted you into the family and avoided all of this entirely. Their crimes were motivated by a need to maintain control, but exposing them has freed Alex in ways they never intended." I nodded, understanding the deeper implications of what was unfolding. The Bennett family's criminal activities hadn't begun with their plan to frame me. Those had simply provided the context for their desperation to maintain power over Alex's inheritance. My investigation had uncovered years of systematic fraud that would have continued indefinitely if they hadn't forced this confrontation. Agent Martinez returned with additional documentation, her expression professional but not uncomfortable. "We've been monitoring the Bennett family's financial activities for 18 months, she explained quietly to Alex and me. "Your engagement actually accelerated their timeline for moving assets offshore, which ultimately made them careless enough for us to build a comprehensive case." Alex looked up at her with hollow eyes. "So Katie and I getting engaged is what triggered all of this?" "No," I said firmly, placing my hand on his arm. "Their criminal activities triggered all of this. Our engagement just provided them with a convenient excuse to accelerate plans they had already put in motion." The distinction was crucial. Alex was struggling with guilt over the role our relationship had played in exposing his family's crimes. But the truth was that those crimes had been ongoing long before I appeared in his life. If anything, our engagement had provided the catalyst for bringing justice to victims who might never have seen their stolen funds recovered. Jenny approached from where she had been coordinating with other federal agents. Her FBI credentials now displayed prominently on her bridesmaid dress. The contrast between her elegant appearance and her professional authority created an almost surreal image that perfectly captured the evening's transformation from celebration to criminal investigation. The financial forensics team has found evidence of fraud dating back almost 10 years, she reported quietly. Charitable donations that were never delivered, municipal contracts that were systematically overbilled, trust funds that were diverted to offshore accounts. The scope is actually larger than we initially suspected. The magnitude of the Bennett family's criminal enterprise was becoming clear. This wasn't simply about hiding assets from a potential divorce settlement. It was about a decade-long pattern of sophisticated financial crimes that had stolen millions from legitimate charities and public projects. As the initial chaos began to settle, the remaining wedding guests found themselves in an unprecedented situation. They had come to celebrate a marriage, and instead had witnessed the systematic exposure of one of Portland's most prominent families as criminal conspirators. Many were prominent business leaders themselves, and the implications of the Bennett family's crimes would ripple through Portland's social and economic circles for years to come. Robert Bennett, Alex's father, had remained notably absent from the evening's revelation. As federal agents secured the crime scene, Agent Martinez explained that he had been taken into custody earlier that afternoon at the family's corporate office. His role in the conspiracy had been primarily focused on the architectural firm's fraudulent billing practices, but his cooperation with federal investigators had been limited. Where does this leave the family business? Alex asked, his voice hollow with the reality of losing not just his family but his professional identity as well. Bennett and Associates will be dissolved, Agent Martinez replied matter-of-factly. All assets will be seized as evidence, and any contracts will be transferred to other firms. The employees will be provided with assistance in finding new positions, but the company itself cannot continue to exist given the extent of the criminal activity. The finality of that statement seemed to hit Alex harder than even the arrest. The architectural firm had been his father's pride, the family legacy he had been raised to inherit and protect. Now it would cease to exist entirely. Not because of business failure but because of criminal conviction. Colonel Rodriguez stepped forward, his military bearing commanding attention even in this chaotic environment. Agent Martinez, what's the timeline for the legal proceedings? My sister and her husband will need to know how long their cooperation will be required. The initial hearings will begin within the week, she replied. Given the scope of the evidence and the defendant's flight risk, we expect them to remain in federal custody until trial. The cooperation phase should be complete within 60 days, assuming no complications arise. The practical aspects of justice were moving forward with bureaucratic efficiency, but the emotional aftermath would take much longer to process. Alex was facing the complete destruction of his family relationships, his professional identity, and his understanding of his own past. The man I had fallen in love with was going to emerge from this experience fundamentally changed. As the federal agents completed their initial evidence collection, the wedding guests began to disperse in small groups, many clearly struggling to process what they had witnessed. The elegant reception that was supposed to showcase Portland's social elite had instead revealed the criminal underbelly that had been hidden beneath years of carefully maintained facades. Patricia Bennett, Alex's mother, had been conspicuously absent from the evening's event. Agent Martinez explained that she had been hospitalized earlier in the week with what appeared to be stress-related symptoms, though it was unclear whether her condition was genuine or an attempt to avoid the legal consequences of her family's actions. Will she face charges as well? Alex asked quietly. That depends on the extent of her involvement and cooperation with the investigation, Agent Martinez replied diplomatically. The evidence suggests she was aware of some activities but may not have been an active participant in the plan. The possibility that his mother might be the only family member to avoid federal prison seemed to provide Alex with a small measure of comfort, though it was clear that even she would face significant legal and social consequences from the scandal. As the crime scene processing continued, Colonel Rodriguez and I found ourselves in the surreal position of managing what remained of our wedding reception. The catering staff, understandably confused by the evening's events, continued to serve food and maintain the bar for the remaining guests who seemed uncertain whether they should leave or stay. Should we make some kind of announcement? I asked my brother, gesturing toward the clusters of guests who were huddled in confused conversation throughout the tent. I think the situation speaks for itself, he replied with dry military humor. Though you might want to reassure people that the investigation doesn't extend beyond the immediate family, some of these business leaders look like they're wondering if they're next. The concern was valid. The Bennett family's criminal activities had involved numerous contractors, suppliers and business partners over the years. While most had been unwitting participants in the fraud, the federal investigation would likely examine many of Portland's business relationships in the coming months. Alex finally stood from his chair, his movements careful and deliberate, as if he were testing his ability to function in this new reality. "I need to talk to the guests," he said quietly. "They deserve some kind of explanation." I started to join him, but he held up a hand. "No, this is something I need to do alone. These are my family's crimes, and I need to take responsibility for the damage they've caused." Watching him walk to the microphone that Rachel had used to launch her attack felt like witnessing a moment of profound transformation. The man who had been protected and controlled by his family's expectations was stepping forward to claim his own voice, even in the midst of devastating personal loss. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alex began, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system despite the tremor of emotion beneath his words. "I owe all of you an apology, not just for the disruption of what was supposed to be a celebration, but for the years of criminal activity that my family conducted while maintaining positions of trust in our community." The tent fell silent as guests turned their full attention to the groom who was addressing his family's crimes on what should have been the happiest day of his life. The courage required to make such a public acknowledgement of responsibility was remarkable, and I felt a surge of pride for the man I had chosen to marry. "I want you to know that I had no knowledge of these activities," he continued, "but I also recognize that ignorance is not an excuse for the harm that has been caused. My wife and I will cooperate fully with federal investigators to ensure that every stolen dollar is recovered and returned to its rightful owners." The use of "my wife" sent a clear message to everyone present. Despite the chaos and revelations, despite the destruction of his family relationships, Alex was choosing our marriage as his foundation for moving forward. The gesture was both public and deeply personal. "For those of you who have been victims of my family's crimes," he went on, "I cannot undo the harm that has been caused, but I can promise that justice will be served and restitution will be made. The Bennett family name will no longer be associated with deception and theft." As Alex spoke, I noticed several guests wiping away tears. The destruction of such a prominent family was genuinely tragic, even when justice was being served. These were people who had known the Bennetts for decades, who had trusted them with business relationships and social connections that were now forever tainted. Agent Martinez approached me as Alex concluded his remark. "Your husband's public statement will be helpful for the investigation," she said quietly. "His willingness to take responsibility and cooperate openly will be noted by the prosecutors." The legal implications of Alex's choices were significant. By publicly acknowledging his family's crimes and committing to full cooperation, he was positioning himself as a willing witness rather than a potential defendant. The decision showed remarkable moral courage, but it also demonstrated the strategic thinking that had made him successful in his architectural career. As the evening wound down, the surreal nature of our situation became even more apparent. We were still wearing our wedding attire, still surrounded by the decorations and flowers meant to celebrate our union, but everything had been fundamentally transformed by the revelations of criminal conspiracy and federal arrest. The cleanup process was unlike anything the Riverside Gardens Estate had ever experienced. Federal evidence collection teams worked alongside wedding coordinators to secure the crime scene while preserving the dignity of what had been intended as a sacred celebration. The contrast between their respective purposes created an almost theatrical atmosphere. Colonel Rodriguez coordinated the practical aspects of concluding the evening, his military training serving him well in managing the logistics of a situation that had no precedent. He arranged for transportation for guests, coordinated with hotel management for those who had traveled from out of town, and ensured that the media presence outside the estate remained controlled and respectful. "The story will break in the morning news cycles," he warned me as we prepared to leave the venue. "Are you and Alex prepared for the media attention that's coming?" The question was sobering. The Bennett family scandal would be major news in Portland and potentially attract national attention given the scope of the criminal enterprise. Our wedding day disaster would become part of the public record, scrutinized by reporters and legal analysts for months to come. Alex overheard the conversation and joined us, his face showing the exhaustion of emotional devastation combined with federal investigation procedures. "We'll handle whatever comes," he said quietly. "The truth is on our side now." His words carried a strength that hadn't been there earlier in the evening. The man who had been manipulated and controlled by his family's criminal conspiracy was beginning to find his own voice and his own sense of moral authority. As we finally left Riverside Gardens Estate in the early hours of the morning, I reflected on the complete transformation of what was supposed to be our perfect wedding day. We had entered the evening as naive participants in someone else's elaborate deception, and we were leaving as federal witnesses in a major criminal investigation. The drive back to Portland was conducted in thoughtful silence, each of us processing the magnitude of what had occurred. Alex stared out the window at the Oregon countryside, his wedding tuxedo wrinkled and his expression distant. Colonel Rodriguez drove with military precision, his attention focused on the road ahead, while remaining alert for any complication. The first rays of dawn were appearing on the horizon as we reached the city limits, painting the sky in soft pastels that seemed incongruously peaceful after the night's drama. Portland was waking up to a new day that would bring revelations about one of its most prominent families that would reshape the city's business and social landscape for years to come. As we pulled into the hotel where Alex and I were staying, media vans were already positioned outside, their occupants waiting for the first opportunity to capture footage or statements about the unfolding scandal. The story was already breaking, and our private tragedy was becoming public entertainment. "Are you ready for this?" Alex asked, taking my hand as we prepared to face the cameras and reporters. I squeezed his fingers, feeling the strength that had carried us through the night's revelation. "Together," I replied simply. We walked into the hotel together, husband and wife, federal witnesses, and survivors of a betrayal that had ultimately revealed the depth of our love and the strength of our commitment to truth and justice. The fairy tale wedding was over, but our real story was just beginning. The federal courthouse in downtown Portland buzzed with activity as our case moved through the legal system, with unprecedented speed. Media crews had established permanent positions outside the building, their satellite trucks creating a small city of journalists eager for any development in what had become known as the Bennett family conspiracy. Alex and I navigated through the crowd of reporters each morning, our faces becoming familiar fixtures on local and national news programs. The preliminary hearings had been devastating for the Bennett family. Federal prosecutors presented evidence with methodical precision, building an ironclad case that left no room for doubt about the scope and duration of their criminal activities. Rachel sat at the defendant's table looking haggard and defeated, a stark contrast to the confident woman who had orchestrated my public humiliation just weeks earlier. Her legal team had attempted several strategies to minimize her involvement, but the recorded conversations and financial documentation made denial impossible. Alex testified as a government witness, his voice steady but hollow as he described years of signing documents he hadn't fully understood, of trusting family members who had systematically deceived him about the nature of their business practices. The emotional toll of testifying against his own family was evident in the weight he had lost and the shadows under his eyes, but his commitment to truth never wavered. "Ms. Bennett," the federal prosecutor asked during his testimony, "when did you first become aware that your family's business practices might be illegal?" Alex looked directly at the jury, his voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. "When my wife showed me documented evidence of money being moved offshore to avoid taxes and hide assets. Until that moment, I believed I was part of a legitimate architectural firm that served Portland's business community." The prosecutor continued methodically through the evidence, establishing Alex's role as an unwitting participant rather than a willing conspirator. His cooperation with federal investigators had been complete and voluntary, providing crucial insider knowledge that had accelerated the investigation and recovery of stolen funds. Mark Thompson's testimony had been particularly damaging to the family's defense strategy. Facing his own lengthy prison sentence, he had agreed to cooperate fully with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced term. His detailed account of the conspiracy's evolution painted a picture of systematic fraud that had grown increasingly bold over the years.
"It started with small adjustments to billing," Mark explained to the jury, his voice barely above a whisper. "Rachel convinced me that we were just smoothing out cash flow problems during difficult months. But then the amounts got larger, and we started creating entirely fictional projects to justify the billing." The courtroom was silent as Mark described how the conspiracy had expanded to include charitable fraud, tax evasion, and ultimately the elaborate plan to frame me as a gold digger to protect their criminal enterprise from scrutiny. His testimony revealed the calculated nature of their attack on my character, showing how they had spent months creating false evidence and coordinating their public humiliation campaign. Linda Hayes had maintained her composure throughout the proceedings, but her legal strategy of denying knowledge of the day-to-day operations had crumbled under the weight of evidence, showing her central role in planning the conspiracy. Bank records showed her signature on documents authorizing offshore transfers, and recorded conversations captured her discussing specific aspects of the fraud in detail. The impact on Portland's business community had been seismic. Several major construction projects had been delayed while federal investigators examined whether they had been subject to fraudulent billing practices.
The Bennett family's charitable foundation had been dissolved, and dozens of legitimate charities were working to recover funds that had been diverted to offshore accounts. Alex and I had moved into a modest apartment near downtown, abandoning the luxurious lifestyle that had been built on criminal proceeds. The adjustment had been difficult for Alex, who was struggling not only with the loss of his family but with the realization that everything he had worked for had been tainted by illegal activity. His architectural career was effectively over, at least in Portland, where the Bennett name would be forever associated with fraud and betrayal. "I keep thinking about all the projects I was proud of," Alex said one evening, as we sat in our small kitchen, reviewing the day's testimony. The community centers, the schools, the public buildings, were any of them legitimate, or was everything I accomplished built on stolen money? The question haunted him, and I could see how the guilt was eating away at his sense of professional identity. The man who had once taken pride in designing Portland's skyline was now wondering whether his entire career had been a lie. "The buildings you designed are real," I reminded him gently. "The communities they serve are real. Whatever your family did with the billing doesn't change the fact that your work has made Portland a better place." But Alex struggled to accept that distinction. The revelation that his professional success had been built on criminal activities had shattered his confidence in ways that went beyond the immediate legal consequences. He was beginning therapy to process the complex trauma of family betrayal, but progress was slow and painful. The media coverage had been relentless and largely unsympathetic to Alex's situation. Despite his cooperation with federal investigators and his public statements taking responsibility for his family's crimes, many commentators portrayed him as either complicit or willfully ignorant. The narrative of the naive architect, manipulated by his criminal family, didn't fit neatly into the media's preference for clear villains and heroes. Colonel Rodriguez had taken leave from his military duties to provide support during the legal proceedings, his presence serving as both emotional anchor and practical coordinator for the chaos surrounding our lives. His experience with complex investigations and high-pressure situations proved invaluable in navigating the federal court system and managing media attention. "The prosecution is confident they have enough evidence for conviction on all major charges," he briefed us after meeting with the federal prosecutor. "Rachel is facing a minimum of 25 years, Mark is looking at 15 to 20, and Linda could receive life imprisonment given her leadership role in the scope of the conspiracy." The sentences seemed appropriate given the magnitude of their crimes, but I found no satisfaction in the prospect of Alex's family spending decades in federal prison. Their destruction had been necessary for justice to be served, but it represented a tragedy that extended far beyond their immediate victims. The financial recovery process had been remarkably successful. Federal investigators had traced most of the stolen funds to offshore accounts and were in the process of returning money to the charities and municipal projects that had been defrauded. The total amount recovered was approaching $50 million, representing nearly a decade of systematic theft from Portland's most vulnerable population. "It's ironic," Jenny observed during one of our weekly dinners together, "that their plan to discredit you as a gold digger led to the recovery of more stolen money than most federal financial crimes investigations see in years." The irony was indeed profound. The Bennett family's desperation to maintain control over Alex's inheritance had accelerated their criminal timeline to the point where they made mistakes that exposed their entire operation. Their attempt to destroy me had ultimately led to justice for hundreds of victims they had never expected to face. Alex's testimony had been completed after 3 days of detailed questioning about his family's business practices, his relationship with me, and his knowledge of the conspiracy to frame me as a fraud. The emotional toll had been severe, but his cooperation had been crucial to the prosecution's case and would likely influence his family's ultimate sentences. The defense attorneys had attempted to portray the conspiracy as a misguided attempt to protect Alex from what they claimed was a calculating woman who had targeted him for his wealth. But the evidence of my own family's financial stability and my brother's military credentials had made that narrative impossible to sustain. Rachel's final attempt to salvage her defense had involved testifying on her own behalf, claiming that her actions had been motivated by genuine concern for Alex's welfare rather than criminal intent. But under cross-examination, federal prosecutors had systematically dismantled her claims, using her own recorded words to demonstrate the calculated nature of her fraud and the deliberate cruelty of her attack on my character. "Ms. Davis," the prosecutor had asked, "in your own words, you described Katie Sullivan as working-class breeding that would eventually show. Can you explain how that statement represents concern for your brother's wealth?" Rachel's attempt to justify her class-based prejudice had been painful to watch, revealing the depth of her contempt not just for me,
but for anyone who didn't meet her narrow standards of social acceptability. Her testimony had likely damaged her case more than helped it, exposing the ugly motivations behind her criminal behavior. The jury deliberations had lasted only 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all major charges against all 3 primary defendants. The speed of their decision reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence and the prosecution's methodical presentation of the case. As the verdicts were read, Rachel collapsed in her chair while Linda maintained her stoic composure and Mark simply stared at the table. Alex gripped my hand tightly as we listened to the verdicts, his face showing a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and closure. The legal phase of our ordeal was concluding, but the emotional recovery would take much longer. The sentencing phase had been equally swift and decisive. Rachel received 30 years in federal prison, Mark was sentenced to 18 years, and Linda was given life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The sentences reflected both the scope of their crimes and their lack of genuine remorse for the damage they had caused. Alex's father, Robert, had negotiated a plea agreement in exchange for his cooperation in recovering additional stolen funds. His sentence of 12 years reflected his lesser role in the conspiracy, but it still meant that Alex would likely never have a relationship with his father again. The dissolution of Bennett and Associates had been handled by federal administrators who ensured that employees were provided with severance packages funded by recovered assets. Several competing architectural firms had hired former Bennett employees, recognizing that most had been unaware of the criminal activities conducted by the family leadership. Alex had struggled with the question of whether to remain in Portland or start over somewhere else entirely. The city held too many painful memories of his family's betrayal, but it was also where we had built our relationship and where his professional reputation, though damaged, still held some value. "I think we need to make our own path," he said one evening as we walked along the Willamette River, watching the city lights reflect on the water, not running away from what happened, but building something new that belongs to us rather than to my family's legacy. The decision to stay in Portland and rebuild had been difficult but ultimately liberating. Alex began working with a small firm that specialized in affordable housing and community development projects, using his skills to serve populations that had often been overlooked by traditional architectural practices. The work was less lucrative than his previous position, but it provided a sense of purpose that had been missing from his corporate career. My own career had taken unexpected directions as well. The publicity from the legal proceedings had led to speaking opportunities at law enforcement conferences about financial crimes and family manipulation. I had developed expertise in recognizing and documenting sophisticated fraud schemes, skills that proved valuable to other federal investigations. The scholarship fund Alex and I had established for children of military families had grown beyond our initial expectations, attracting donations from people who had been inspired by our story of surviving family betrayal and emerging stronger. The fund had provided college assistance to over 200 students in its first year, creating positive outcomes from the tragedy of the Bennett family's crimes. 6 months after the sentencing, Alex and I had found a rhythm in our new life together. We lived simply but happily, our relationship strengthened by having survived the ultimate test of trust and loyalty. The man I had married was fundamentally different from the person who had proposed to me 2 years earlier, but the changes had been positive ones that revealed his core character. We had remarried in a simple ceremony at the Rodriguez Ranch, surrounded by family and close friends who had supported us throughout the legal ordeal. The contrast with our original wedding could not have been more stark, but the second ceremony felt authentic in ways that the first, despite its elegance, had never achieved. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Rachel had never tried to expose those fake documents?" Alex asked as we sat on our apartment balcony, watching the sunset paint Portland's skyline in shades of gold. The question was intriguing but ultimately irrelevant. Their criminal activities would have continued, I replied. More charities would have been robbed, more public projects would have been defrauded, and you would have spent your life unknowingly participating in their conspiracy. The truth was that Rachel's attack on me had been the catalyst for justice, not just for us but for hundreds of victims who had been systematically robbed over the years. Her attempt to destroy me had instead exposed the real criminals and led to the recovery of millions of dollars in stolen funds. As darkness settled over the city, Alex and I reflected on how completely our lives had changed. The fairy tale wedding that had turned into a nightmare had ultimately become the foundation for a stronger, more honest relationship built on shared values rather than family expectations or social pressure. The story of how they tried to humiliate me at my wedding had become a story of justice served, truth revealed, and love that survived the ultimate test of betrayal and public scrutiny. Sometimes the worst attacks reveal the strength we never knew we possessed, and sometimes the courage to fight back leads to victories we never could have imagined. 2 years had passed since the courtroom verdicts echoed through downtown Portland, and the transformation in our lives felt almost miraculous. I stood in the kitchen of our new home in the Pearl District, preparing breakfast while watching Alex through the window as he worked in our small garden. The man who had once designed skyscrapers for criminal enterprises now found deep satisfaction in coaxing tomatoes and herbs from Portland's rich soil. Our house was modest but filled with warmth that had been absent from the grand spaces of his family's estate. Every piece of furniture, every painting on the walls, every book on our shelves had been chosen together, creating a space that reflected our shared values rather than inherited expectations. The morning light streaming through our kitchen windows illuminated a life built on honesty and mutual respect. Alex entered through the back door, dirt still clinging to his hands from his morning gardening routine. His face showed the kind of contentment that comes from meaningful work and genuine peace. The architectural firm specializing in affordable housing had become more than just employment for him, it had become his calling, allowing him to use his skills to create homes for families who had never imagined owning property. The Henderson Community Center broke ground yesterday, he announced, washing his hands at the sink. 50 units of affordable housing, plus community spaces for job training and childcare. The first families should be able to move in by next spring. The project represented everything Alex had discovered about himself after his family's downfall. Instead of designing monuments to wealth and power, he was creating spaces that would strengthen communities and provide opportunities for working families. The satisfaction he derived from this work far exceeded anything he had experienced in his previous career. My own professional journey had taken equally unexpected turns. The expertise I had gained in financial crime investigation during our ordeal had opened doors to consulting work with federal agencies and nonprofit organizations. I helped other victims navigate complex fraud cases, using my experience to guide them through the legal and emotional challenges of family betrayal. The Rodriguez Foundation received another major donation yesterday, I shared over breakfast. A tech executive whose family tried to defraud him out of his company. He said our story gave him the courage to fight back instead of just walking away. The foundation we had established to help victims of family financial abuse had grown beyond our wildest expectations. Funded primarily by recovered assets from the Bennett family's crimes, it provided legal assistance, counseling services, and financial support for people whose trust had been exploited by those closest to them. Colonel Rodriguez had returned to active duty but remained closely involved in our foundation's work. His military expertise and complex investigations proved invaluable in helping other families document sophisticated fraud schemes. The skills he had used to protect national security were now serving civilians who faced similar challenges in their personal lives. Alex's relationship with his parents had evolved in unexpected ways. His father Robert had served 18 months of his sentence before being granted early release for his continued cooperation with federal investigators. The man who emerged from federal prison was humbled and genuinely remorseful, finally understanding the magnitude of damage his family's crimes had inflicted on innocent victims. Dad called yesterday, Alex mentioned, his tone neutral but not hostile. He's been working with a construction crew in Eugene, doing manual labor for the first time in his life. He says it's helping him understand the value of honest work. The relationship between father and son remained strained but was gradually healing. Robert's genuine contrition and his efforts to rebuild his life through honest labor had impressed Alex, though full forgiveness would take time. They spoke occasionally, cautiously rebuilding trust that had been shattered by years of deception. Patricia Bennett had avoided criminal charges but had suffered a complete nervous breakdown during the legal proceedings. She now lived quietly in a small apartment funded by a trust that had escaped federal seizure, her mental health too fragile to withstand the stress of rebuilding her life. Alex visited her monthly, providing emotional support while maintaining appropriate boundaries. Rachel's imprisonment had been marked by complete denial and increasing bitterness. She had refused all visits from Alex and had rejected opportunities for reduced sentences in exchange for cooperation with other investigations. Her letters from federal prison, forwarded through her attorneys, continued to blame me for destroying the family rather than accepting responsibility for her own crimes. I received another letter from Rachel's lawyer, I mentioned, showing Alex the unopened envelope. Do you want to know what she's saying this time? Alex shook his head firmly. She made her choices, just like we made ours. I'm done letting her poison our peace. The decision to maintain no contact with Rachel had been difficult but necessary. Her continued hostility and refusal to acknowledge the harm she had caused made any relationship impossible. Alex had grieved the loss of his sister, but he had also recognized that the person he had loved had probably never existed. Linda Hayes had died in federal prison 8 months earlier, her advanced age and the stress of imprisonment taking their toll. Alex had attended her funeral, standing alone at the graveside of the woman who had orchestrated his family's criminal enterprise. Her death had provided a kind of closure, marking the definitive end of the Bennett family's reign over Portland's business community. Mark Thompson had been released after serving 14 months of his sentence, his cooperation with federal investigators earning him significant reduction in his term. He had moved to Seattle and was working as a junior architect at a small firm, slowly rebuilding his career under a cloud of professional disgrace. He had written to Alex several times, seeking forgiveness that would probably never come. The ripple effects of the Bennett family scandal continued to influence Portland's business community. New oversight procedures had been implemented for municipal contracts, charitable foundations faced increased scrutiny, and several other families had been investigated for similar schemes. The case had become a cautionary tale taught in business schools and law enforcement academies across the country. Our wedding day disaster had been documented in a book written by a local journalist, with proceeds donated to victim assistance programs. The story of how a small-town teacher had outwitted a sophisticated criminal conspiracy had resonated with readers nationwide, inspiring others who faced seemingly impossible challenges in their own lives. Alex and I had been invited to speak at conferences and seminars about resilience, family loyalty versus moral obligation, and the importance of fighting for truth even when the cost seems unbearable. These speaking engagements had become an important part of our foundation's outreach efforts, helping us reach people who might not otherwise seek assistance. The financial recovery from the Bennett family's crimes had exceeded all expectations. Federal investigators had traced additional offshore accounts and recovered nearly $70 million in stolen funds. The money had been returned to defrauded charities and municipal projects, funding programs that would benefit Portland's communities for decades to come. One particularly meaningful development had been the establishment of the Bennett Victims Memorial Scholarship, funded entirely by recovered assets. The scholarship provided college assistance for students from working-class families, specifically those who had been affected by white-collar crime. The irony of using Bennett family money to help the exact populations they had looked down upon was not lost on any of us. Alex's work with affordable housing had earned recognition from community organizations and urban planning professionals. His designs prioritized functionality and dignity, creating spaces where working families could build stable lives without the stigma often associated with subsidized housing. The contrast with his family's emphasis on ostentation and exclusion was deliberate and profound. The mayor wants to discuss expanding the affordable housing initiative citywide, Alex shared, reviewing architectural plans over breakfast. If the pilot projects continue to succeed, we could be looking at thousands of new units over the next 5 years. The prospect of such large-scale impact excited both of us. The Bennett family had used their architectural expertise to enrich themselves at the community's expense. Alex was using his skills to strengthen communities and provide opportunities for economic advancement. My consulting work had evolved to include training programs for financial institutions and law enforcement agencies. The sophisticated nature of modern family financial abuse required specialized knowledge to detect and prosecute effectively. My experience as both victim and survivor provided unique insights that proved valuable to professionals working in this field. The FBI wants me to develop a training curriculum for agents working family financial crime cases, I mentioned, reviewing emails on my laptop. They think my perspective as a target who fought back could help them better support other victims. The opportunity represented the culmination of my transformation from victim to expert. The skills I had developed to protect my marriage were now serving others who faced similar challenges, creating positive outcomes from what had initially been a devastating betrayal. Our relationship had emerged from the crisis stronger and more authentic than either of us had thought possible. The superficial social pressures that had characterized our original engagement had been stripped away, leaving behind a partnership based on shared values and genuine mutual respect. "Do you ever miss the old life?" I asked Alex as we sat on our front porch that evening, watching neighbors walk their dogs through our quiet residential street. Alex considered the question seriously before responding. "I miss feeling secure, but I don't miss feeling controlled. I miss my family, but I don't miss their life. I miss the financial comfort, but I don't miss wondering if everything I had was built on someone else's suffering." His answer captured the complexity of our situation perfectly. We had lost material comfort but gained peace of mind. We had lost social status but gained genuine community connections. We had lost family relationships but strengthened our marriage beyond what we had thought possible. The evening air carried the scent of jasmine from our garden, and the distant sound of children playing in the nearby park. Our neighborhood was diverse and dynamic, filled with young families, retirees, and working professionals who had chosen community over exclusivity. The contrast with the isolated grandeur of the Bennett estate was striking and welcome. As darkness settled over Portland, Alex and I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment of quiet happiness. The woman who had stood in that wedding tent, facing public humiliation and false accusations, felt like a different person entirely. The man who had been manipulated by his criminal family had discovered reserves of strength and moral courage he had never known he possessed. Our phones buzzed simultaneously with messages from Colonel Rodriguez, now stationed in Germany but still actively involved in our foundation's work. The time difference meant he was starting his day as we were ending ours, but he made a point of checking in with us regularly. "Another family in Phoenix needs assistance with a financial fraud case," his message read. "The parallels to your situation are remarkable. Would you be available for a consultation call this weekend?" The request represented the ongoing nature of our mission to help other families navigate the complex challenges of financial betrayal. Each case taught us new strategies and reinforced our commitment to ensuring that other victims had the resources and support we had been fortunate enough to access. "Are you ready for another case?" Alex asked, reading the message over my shoulder. I considered the question, thinking about the emotional energy required to guide another family through the trauma we had experienced. "Always," I replied without hesitation. "Every family we help makes our own suffering worthwhile." The truth of that statement had become the foundation of our new life. The Bennett family's attempt to destroy us had instead revealed our capacity for resilience, justice, and transformation. Their crimes had been exposed, their victims compensated, and their legacy of deception replaced with our commitment to truth and service. As we prepared for bed that night, I looked around our modest home with deep satisfaction. The furniture was simple, the spaces small, but everything reflected our genuine choices rather than inherited expectations. The life we had built together was authentic in ways that our previous existence had never been. The story of how they tried to humiliate me at my wedding had become the story of how we discovered who we really were beneath the facades of family loyalty and social expectation. Sometimes the worst betrayals reveal our greatest strengths, and sometimes the courage to fight for truth leads to happiness more profound than we ever dared to imagine. The fairy tale had ended in that wedding tent 2 years ago, but our real love story was just beginning, built on the unshakable foundation of truth, justice, and the knowledge that together we could survive anything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.